and you may get a notification that you, on behalf of our Dr. Nishibayashi, who is below me on this someplace, is our vice chair of our board, and I guess I should ask Canon Nishibayashi to welcome you on behalf of Bloy House. This is actually the first class like this we've ever done, and I'm really happy. We have 21 people who signed up, which really is more than we thought. We're trying to keep the cost down. This is not how we make our money, but we want to serve and have this as affordable as possible. So if you know people that would like to take the class but can't afford the $25, I'm hearing myself echo on somebody's.
Yeah, so everyone go ahead.
I'm going to mute everybody.
Yeah, go ahead and mute yourself. And that will help audio for sure.
I'm going to mute everybody. Then, Gabri, I will unmute you in a minute. So anyway, if you know people that would like to take this class and for whom 25 or whatever, what is it, $50 is steep, please ask them to contact me, ghall@cst@Bloy House. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to let people in on a sliding scale and stuff, because we really want to serve the Diocese of LA as our institutional mission. And a class like this really is an attempt to break out a little bit from being a preacher factory, which we've been for over 50 years, into a place that serves a wide range of educational needs in the Diocese of LA. This class actually came to be because I was speaking to, when we were in the middle of our COVID lockdown, the bishop invited me to speak to the clergy Zoom meeting we have every Thursday during those days. And I asked for some ideas about classes people would find interesting. And the eminent Gabri Ferrer suggested, a class on Christian nationalism. And so I made an appointment with him and we started talking about this, and we decided this is something we would really like to do together. We'll introduce ourselves a little more formally in a second. Gabri is much more versed in this because of his experience in a wider range of the church than I have. And so we're splitting up the teaching tonight. And then after we hear from you, we're going to design the following 3 weeks in the class. So let's begin first by, I'm going to introduce myself very briefly and then ask Gabri to introduce himself. And then we'll go around and ask everyone to say something about themselves and maybe say something about what you're interested in finding out, what you're interested in exploring or pursuing in a class like this. So I'm Gary Hall. I'm the interim dean of Bloy House. I'm a longtime priest in this diocese, but I was away for a long time as well. My last job was as dean of the National Cathedral in Washington. And in that job, I had a lot of occasion to engage the intersection of faith and public life, and to run afoul of some of the people we're going to talk about tonight, especially with our stances on things like gun violence and same-sex marriage. But I also have a part of my career was I was an English teacher. And when I went to graduate school at UCLA in the 80s, I was particularly interested in American literature and American religious literature before 1900. So I'm going to say a little bit about that tonight. And I turn it over to Gabri to tell us about himself. And I'll ask you to unmute.
Oh, it's my turn to tell me about, talk about myself. All right. So yeah, I'm Gabri Ferrer. I am the Dean of Deanery 2, which is what got me in conversation with Gary. And I am one of those odd ducks in the Episcopal Church that find their way and fall in love with our particular flavor of denomination. And because I don't go away, they say, well, I guess he's not leaving, so we might as well give him something to do. At least it seems that way to me. I'm happy to be here because I have wandered through the world of many different religious traditions, but I was raised Roman Catholic as a kid, found my way to the Jesus movement, as it was called, in high school. From there, went to a non-denominational church called the Vineyard, got married to my wife and started dating, going to her church, which was a Foursquare church, an offshoot of Pentecostalism. Our very own Amy Semple McPherson, LA, famous, was the head of that denomination, or church that became a denomination, and eventually found my way to the Episcopal Church through All Saints Beverly Hills. And again, absolutely fell in love with the theology, the liturgy, and the breadth of the church, the welcoming nature, and the sense that no matter where you were on the scale, from right to left or high to low, that you were welcome to worship with us. That has been diminished, sadly, a bit as folks have left for a variety of reasons, but I still hold that this is one of the charisms of Anglicanism as a whole, and the Episcopal Church in particular. I think I'll hit the pause button there, Gary, and unless you want me to continue to blather.
No, but you blather very nicely, Gabri. I should say just also that I'm the obverse of Gabri. I was raised as nothing, and didn't actually enter a church building till I was in college, and then got interested in the church largely because so many clergy I admired were involved in civil rights and anti-war movements. So I'm in some ways a little bit more typical of Episcopal clergy. There are a lot of Episcopal clergy like me who grew up in unchurched households and then sort of discovered church as young adults and then went whole hog and, bought the entire program. So I was raised in a really secular household, a very politically active household, but a secular in terms of religious stuff. And then I guess I showed my parents. I became a priest fairly early in my life, and have done that ever since. What I'd like to do, and since these things are all different in terms of my screen looks different than your screen, none of them look the same in terms of where we are relative to each other. I think I'm just going to go around the horn here and ask people to introduce themselves briefly, because we got a bunch of people, and maybe to say something whatever you'd like us to know about yourself, but also one thing, is there anything you would really like us to address in these 4 weeks? And I'll be taking notes as you say these things, and I will unmute. I will try to unmute everybody if I can remember how to do it. I guess you have to unmute yourself. So what I'm going to do is just go around the horn. Nathan, you're the first person on my left, and you texted earlier that you have trouble with your audio. Is that still the case? I am having technical difficulties. He's going to tell us in a second. What I'd like to see addressed is, okay, Nathan, we'll come back to you when you complete that sentence, and we will note that. Ria, can you introduce yourself and unmute yourself?
Hi, I'm Ria Helene Lindauer. I don't really use the second part of my hyphenated first name, the Helene part, just the Ria. I'm a member of St. Martin's in the Field in Winnetka. Half my family are Roman Catholics and the other half are Anglicans. All of my cousins and uncles and my parents attended Lutheran elementary schools, and we all attended Catholic high schools. and I have sort of a mixed experience with attending Cal Lutheran and then as well as attending public universities. And I don't really know. I guess if you ask me a few weeks from now, what I'd like to focus on, I can answer better than I can now. I just read about it yesterday. I've got an email, and so I'm interested in seeing what's going to be discussed and what that all means. So if I may,
You can defer.
yes, please. Until later, I
As
will.
we say, all may, some should, none must. Nathan Tech put in the chat, what does nationalism mean in a Christian context? It seems to me there are several ways to define nationalism, and I'm curious about how we define it here. Okay, I think we'll probably get to that tonight, but if we don't, help me remember that we owe you that definition. Linda Jacobson.
Hi, I'm Linda Jacobson. I'm also a member of St. Martin in the Fields in Winnetka. And
I'm Eric Jacobson.
my husband, Eric, and I don't know. I'd like to see the class unfold. I'm with Rhea on wanting to defer and see what questions come up as you guys define and sort of set the stage here for what we're going to learn.
Great. Margaret. Unmute.
Sorry. Well, the class looked really interesting to me. My background, I grew up in an extremely conservative farm community in southern Indiana. I had an unusual mother, though she was from the same community. She was inspired to go to seminary, and she taught a little bit at Union Seminary. She was very, very liberal and very much preached inclusion to me and was real involved in early peace and civil rights issues. I felt pretty uncomfortable in the churches in my county, but I had a really strong Christian belief, and that was kind of based in inclusion. And so, the subject seemed very fascinating to me.
Steve Nishibayashi. Unmute.
Thank you, Dean. Oh, first of all, on behalf as Vice Chair of the Board of Boy House, I want to welcome and thank all of you for attending and being really trailblazers as Boy House reimagines the needs of the Diocese of Los Angeles and the future of the church. I've been blessed and honored to be the Vice Chair for the last 16 years now, and very excited to see programs such as we're beginning tonight take place. Personally, I want to try and learn how to understand what seems to be a disconnect between my understanding of a loving, life-giving, liberating Christian community and how that conflicts with what I see being proposed as the will of God. And what white nationalism and the history of the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, and other denominations, how that seems to not connect with where I feel the church is and should be going forward.
Thanks. Well, I was gonna call on Kathy, but she's disappeared. She's been raptured, I think. All right, we'll come back. Carol Potter, can you?
Yeah, I'm Carol. I go to All Saints in Beverly Hills, and I'm working with Colleen as part of the Poor People's Campaign. And one of the things, we're in this faith working group, one of the things we're trying to address is the distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism. So I'm really interested in the issue of, so what is their theology that they derive from the gospel and the Bible as a whole? And how is that different or the same as their ideology? Because I have a feeling these things are enmeshing in some way. And of course, how do you approach a person who has this perspective and try to make a connection with them?
Right. Thank you. Janice.
Yes, I'm Janice Smith. I'm a member of all St. Martin's in the Fields, and I'm delighted to be here. I think that I'm so proud of the Episcopal Church to open up to these different things. I was able to take Sacred Ground last October, and I'm so happy to see that that's opening up all over the country, and we'll have it at our church. So I'm glad that the Episcopal Church is allowing us to get into relevant topics within our country. We need all communication. Everybody needs to be communicating about their different feelings and beliefs. And I think this is amazing. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabrielle, we're going to have to give a tuition kickback to St. Martin's, I think. You're by far you get the Salesman of the Month award from Playhouse in terms of corralling your parishioners. Kathy Finley, you were away when I called on you, and so if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Kathy Finley. I also go to St. Martin's. I've been following in Gabri's footsteps for a long time. So we came to All Saints sort of at the same time. Our kids kind of grew up together. I did children's ministry at All Saints for 14 years and catechesis at the Good Shepherd for 12. And then through that process became a contemplative and ended up at Richard Rohr's Living School for 2 years. And I was an art major. So my background is drawing, painting, writing icons, fun art, and but as a contemplative path. So I'm interested in how Christian nationalism, Christian beliefs have sort of become a political chip, like everything else, and what that means and how we can address that. And I just think I don't know that much about it, but I've read a couple articles like in the New York Times and stuff that sort of talk about it, and it just makes my hair catch on fire, sort of. So I am interested in it.
Great, thank you. Somebody's got an alert going on.
Are we having a fire drill?
Yeah, yeah. Everybody assemble out in the courtyard. Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Moore. I go to St. Martin. And I read a little bit about Christian nationalism, and it sounded to me like this is Christianity in service of the nationalism. And if that's right, that's idolatrous. And I found it disturbing, and I'm really interested in finding out if that's what's really going on. And I'd like to know how they came about and why and what they're doing now. And are they gaining ground? Are they losing ground? All those things.
Jamie.
Hi, everyone. I'm a former All Saints parishioner. So I know Kathy Finley and I know Gabri. Gabri actually baptized my daughter and confirmed my son. So we
Got
have
them
some
ready
history.
for confirmation. That's a bishop's job.
Ready for confirmation. Sorry. Shows my ignorance of some of the protocol. My grandmother was very Roman Catholic. My mom was very not. And when I would visit my grandmother, I would have this, when I was very young, I would go to Catholic Mass, and then I would go to Episcopal Sunday school. So I started to dread Sundays pretty actively after a few years of doing this. So I sort of became a-religious for a while. And then I had I majored at university in one of the history majors I had was Reformation and Renaissance and Reformation. And so we got into it very much, particularly by a really great professor who was Jewish, and said the reason he got into this area was he was fascinated after growing up hearing about the pogroms of the Cossacks and everything else. He was from Russia. To hear this period of history where Christians were killing each other about, who had the key to the kingdom of heaven and other major issues like that. He was fascinated by it. And so he got into that. And at the same time, I was also studying China and had a professor who was a communist who was telling me all the different viewpoints one could have and should have in understanding of various historical issues. So between the two of them, the result was I became a community organizer, and then started a company making maps and continuing to be a community organizer up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Of course, after that, I went to business school. It's a natural progression. And I was the kind of weird guy because I was doing an urban planning, regional economics deal where we had a lot of stuff about housing and, what was happening in terms of the urban frontiers and stuff. And I was also at business school, and the business school was actually welcoming new ideas. And the Graduate School of Art and Architecture had a Stalinist chairman who was defrocked because he was so extreme. He was Peter Marcuse, son of Herbert Marcuse, who you may know was Angela Davis's advisor some time ago. So all that sort of hectic education meant that I'm fascinated by the topic of what our country is. And I also spent some time in Washington, did some semi-government service for a few years. And what I am puzzled about and worried about is the emerging class warfare that I think is happening in the United States. The insane allocation of wealth to such a small handful of people, which I think is extremely corrosive. Added to that most of our major cities now, people can't afford to live unless you're extremely wealthy. We did a calculation at Kemble Hall, I'm on the board there, and if you wanted to pay your kid to go to a private school, we figured you really had to be earning more than $400,000 a year. Yeah. That's insane. That's insane. I mean, just purely insane. And the trend line is one where I'm seeing, continued examples of the elites not giving a damn about anybody else besides themselves in a way that's really worrisome. I think they're abdicating their role as anything as leaders of this country because they really only care about themselves. And I think it's worrisome. And I think part of it is, to use a simple term, a lack of a moral compass. They have no checks, they have no balances, there's no feeling of owing anybody anything other than just making sure you have to pay the fine if you get caught. And I think Christian nationalism to me means a country that's hopefully, at least to some extent, has leaders that are at least trying to think about what is the right thing to do in a moral, ethical viewpoint. And I think Christianity provides a lot of that. And I think it's hopefully not too late. I really hope it's not too late. I worry that it is because I worry about my kids and their grandkids. So that's me.
Thank you. Linda, you have your hand up. Do you mean to have your hand up? Hold on. Can you unmute there?
Yeah, no, that's me. That's my hand.
Oh,
I'm Eric, and I'm curious about the term Christian nationalism because I remember a bunch of years ago, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, there was a politician who was running for office, and she was accused of being a Christian nationalist. No context. There was no explanation about what that meant, other than they said she was a Christian nationalist because she was a fan of Francis Schaeffer. And I had studied at Francis Schaeffer's Foundation in Switzerland. So I'm just curious. I have no idea what that is.
I don't either.
By the end of this hour, you will.
You will? Okay.
You'll have a working definition.
Okay. See, Gabri's much more confident than I am. All right. Thank you. So, Anne.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I too hail from THADS, which was an offshoot of All Saints Beverly Hills. So I attend THADS with Jamie Soames. And I, just to build on some of his comments, I come at it from probably a similar spirit. I too care very, very deeply about the church, about our city, and about our country, as flawed as all three of those are. I still believe in the church, and I still believe in our city, and I still believe in our country. And I think it's a moment in time to be firmly open heart, I guess, firmly rooted and grounded in God's love and with an open heart and with a rigorous mind. And so my hope, I guess, to me, the reason why this country is so exceptional and so great, again, in spite of all the flaws, and there's always room to grow, is there is a Judeo-Christian underpinning that are the foundation from which the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution sit. And there's a lot that I see in the news and just in society overall where that's really questioned. And so I'm just trying to be really open-minded and trying to learn, and I'm open to perspectives, and I just want to hang out with Gabri too.
Thank God you got fans, Gabri. Deborah.
Hello. I too was a Gabri follower. I met Gabri and a lot of the others of you at All Saints Beverly Hills. And I am very curious about what Christian nationalism really is, because it's disturbing that this term to me. Nationalism of any sort seems to be very scary and exclusive, and smacks of the privileged wielding power over other people that don't have it. And I'd like very much to understand it better, because I don't know where we fit in or where I would fit in. I want to fit in a positive way that isn't just talking the good talk, but actually doing something. And I don't have a plan. I don't know what Christian should do other than the day-to-day things that we try to remember, to being kind and helpful and generous, but in a larger sense. So that's what I'm looking forward to learning.
Okay. Thank you. Nicola.
Hi, it's Nicola.
Nicola.
But,
I was going back in my head.
That's
Nicola,
okay.
Nicola. Sorry.
I also go to St. Martin in the Fields. I came with, as many others did, followed Gabri from All Saints Beverly Hills. I'm a cradle Episcopalian. This past year, during COVID, spending much time on Zoom, I followed churches and joined groups all around the country dealing with racial justice and social issues. So Carol, the Poor People's Campaign is very interesting to me, and somebody at Heavenly Rest in New York is very involved. So I've enjoyed hearing that. I am very interested in what the role of the church is in social and racial justice, and personally haven't heard enough of it at church. So I'm fascinated to find out what our responsibility is as Christians, and also dismayed that the Christian right has made Christian a dirty word. And that's it.
Thank you. Colleen.
Hello, I'm Colleen, and I convene the LA People's Campaign Faith Working Group, and Carol spoke very well for while we're here, and I'm hoping to have a couple other people from our group join us as well, because we, as Carol mentioned, have these conversations all the time. I think in addition to what Carol said, I'm very much interested in understanding I guess first, if Christian nationalism, if we kind of can fall into that, whether we consider ourselves liberals or conservatives. I'm curious how we may be in Christian nationalist thinking, and in particular, if Christian nationalism has, or nationalism in general, has any links to patriotism, which we all kind of find ourselves on board with. Also curious if we Christians are alone in nationalist thinking, or if Christian nationalism and religious nationalism, how they're related, how we may be more like our Taliban brothers and sisters than we want to think we are. So, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Suzanne.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I am also from St. Martin's. And I come from a family that embraces a multitude of major religions. And so we have some really interesting conversations at the dinner table because we all love each other and we're all pretty much liberals. But because of that, I find the idea of the United States as a Christian nationalist nation really scary. And so I'm kind of hoping to learn more about it and what all of your views are on it. And basically, I guess kind of also how we prevent being co-opted by the right wing as Christians. I mean, how do we say, no, Christians aren't just people who want to destroy other people's rights. We want to embrace the world. So, you know, a lot of what everybody else has said, I totally agree with.
Okay. Larry. You're muted.
Hi. Yeah, I may be the first person to speak that didn't know Gabri before today. Gary brought me into the house here. Gary is my personal spiritual advisor. I'm not affiliated particularly with any church, although I probably have been to All Saints Pasadena more than any other church. Christian nationalism is a scary idea to me. I don't like religious states at all. I don't think nationalism and religion go together. And so I assumed Christian nationalism refers to something like white supremacy or white nationalism. And I have a very hard time communicating with people of that ilk. Fundamentalism itself is hard for me to relate to or understand. So I want to hear more about this movement and the ideas of people in this movement, because maybe there's some common ground. I figure that in my life it would be better if I could meet what I consider the enemy and somehow work with those people and bring them to a more enlightened place. So I want to learn more about it here.
Great. Lynn. You're muted. You're still muted.
Mute.
There you go.
I think you did that. I attend St. Luke's in Monrovia, and I was raised in the Episcopal Church, but we moved many times when we were children. So my mother, we ended up going to church often, whatever church was in the little town. So, but we spent years here in El Monte at the Emmanuel Church, and now it's become, they give food and medicine to people. And so I'm quite proud of that. But I started attending St. Luke's in 2002, and my mother attended there. And so, but the interesting thing during this pandemic, I didn't Zoom with my own church. I Zoomed with my sister's Anglican church up in Vancouver, British Columbia, St. Thomas's. So it was good. It was fun, and it gave me a different perspective. And then it was such a wonderful feeling when we finally on July 4th were able to come back into the church. All of us were so happy. And but anyway, I'm listening to all of you, and I just want to learn more about Christian nationalism. I don't know a whole lot about it. It is a bit scary to me. So that's why I'm here. And thank you.
Great. Chrissy.
Hi, I'm Chrissy. I'm from St. Francis in Simi Valley. And I think like my draw to the class would be that in the class description, what was offered up as the definition for Christian nationalism just really didn't fit with anything that I had ever associated it with. So I just came to learn.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to get this name wrong too. Is it Zakiya? Zakiya?
No. Hi, Zakiya. Zakiya, right?
I'm wrong. I get all the first guess is always wrong. Okay. Zakiya.
I'm joining from Hollywood Lutheran. I actually go attend Adore LA, which is a new start that occupies some space with Hollywood Lutheran. I'm interested in this subject mainly to know sort of like the talking points in the history behind Christian nationalism so that we can, form our own language around rebutting it and letting folks know who Christ really is and not the sort of co-opt version that Christian nationalism has been able to sort of spread and say who God and Jesus is to us, but to be able to say, no, it's not. And this is who Christ is. So thanks.
Great. Thank you. Arthur.
Hello, yes, I'm Arthur Langton. I'm a parishioner at St. Martin's in the Field, but I did not come from All Saints in Beverly Hills. I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I was an acolyte at St. David's in North Hollywood. Knew the Reverend Alexander K. Campbell for many years, founder at Campbell Hall, although I did not attend Campbell Hall. I'm a graduate of UCLA in geography with a minor in life science. I taught 8th grade science at Sutter Middle School, which is just across the street from St. Martin's. So I was familiar with the kids in the neighborhood at one time. I'm a bird watcher and into environmental things and past president of the Audubon Society in the San Fernando Valley. And interested in the program because I scanned through the opinion ad, the op-ed section of the LA Times daily and saw the term Christian nationalism and didn't know what it was, didn't know what it referred to, didn't know what it meant. The term was never defined in the article. And then 2 days later, I get this email that Gabriel is going to explain it all to us in great detail. And so I said, if it's that important, I better find out about it so that at least I know what's coming off. So that's me.
Thank you. Okay. And last but not least, Van. Van, you need to unmute.
Okay. Vandy Shields, I'm in Los Angeles, and I attend the Episcopal Church in Echo Park. And I've been in several movements and different situations over the years as an activist in Los Angeles. And when this came along, I really honestly don't see an end to it. But my logic or my better sense of thought is that if we don't address it, it's going to get larger and it's going to consume a lot of people and a lot of issues. And so we should face it, even though I don't have the confidence right now. And that's why I'm here, to gain the confidence that we can have a conversation with these people before it gets out of hand, because it gets very populated and very opinionated. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk for just a few minutes as the warm-up act to Gabri. I'm going to talk a little bit about, we decided we want to look at the following things over the course of the next few weeks. Tonight, we're going to talk about sort of history, a little bit about history before 1900 that I'm going to do. And then Gabri's going to talk about sort of major sort of church movements since 1900 that have led us to this point. And then in the next few weeks, we're also going to talk about, in some ways, this is all a confluence of church, media, and politics. And so we want to devote probably one session to the church, one session to media, and one session to politics. I'll start, and I don't want to preclude Gabri's definition of it, but one of the other ways to describe Christian nationalism is what we used to call American exceptionalism. The idea that America is a divinely ordained instrument of God's purpose in the world. And of course, that's shot through our culture. It's more intense now among a subset of American Christians for a variety of reasons that I think Gabri will get to. But it's basically this set of ideas that in somehow Christianity and the United States are inextricably linked. I've put in the chat a link to an article in the Washington Post that was done in May by a friend of mine, Sarah Pulliam Bailey, who is a religion writer for the Post. And it was an article she wrote about the God Bless America Bible, that is a new Bible that's been printed that has the Bible and also Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the links to the country music song, the lyrics to the country music song about "Thank God I'm an American." And so, but that article kind of explains a little bit about how it's used in common parlance, and Gabri will have more to say about that, I think, in his part. I want to talk just a little bit about America before 1900, because that actually that's sort of what I know most about, but also because as an Episcopalian, it seems to me we've got to be clear that we don't have particularly clean hands when it comes to this kind of language. And I say this as someone who served a cathedral in Washington, D.C. that originally described itself as America's Westminster Abbey. That was actually in the founding documents of Washington National Cathedral. It was founded and given to the nation by the Episcopal Church as the official place for Americans to bury their presidents and celebrate great moments of national joy and national sorrow. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It was very generous, I guess, but it's also a little presumptuous, right? To say that, who says the Episcopal Church is the official religion of the United States? Well, our tradition says something like that because those of us that are Episcopalians are descended from the Church of England. And the Church of England was and is the established church of the United Kingdom. And most Anglican churches around the world are the established churches in their countries, except for us, because as you know, the First Amendment, the first thing that Congress shall make no law establish with respect to the establishment of religion. I'm actually a little bit more of a strict constructionist about the First Amendment. I think it really means there will be no established religion in the United States. It doesn't mean that, the state doesn't have a say in some religious questions or the church doesn't have a say in some state issues. But we as inheritors of that established church tradition are a little bit compromised when we start pointing the finger at Christian nationalists who want to make a claim that America is God's country or is Jesus's country, because we kind of have said that every place else in the world except here, right? As you know, Prince Charles has tried to deal with that. When he becomes king, he's tried to talk about, rather than being the defender of the faith, to being the defender of faith. And he's trying to wrestle with what it means to eventually be the king of a multiracial, multi-religious nation. And of course, the Church of England is pushed back in horror and disgust and dismay over that possibility. So I want to start with the fact that those of us that are part of the Episcopal Church are part of a church culture that has often seen itself as the established culture. And so it's hard for us, we just have to acknowledge that before we start pointing our fingers at Franklin Graham or other people, because they're not saying much more than stuff we've said over the course of our history. That's one set of things. The second set of things is that the idea of theocracy, the idea of America being a divinely established country with one established religion goes back very early in our national history. Those of you who remember Ronald Reagan's first inaugural, when he quoted John Winthrop, who gave the great sermon aboard the Arabella in 1629, as the Puritans were making their way to the Massachusetts Bay. John Winthrop, quoting Matthew 5, called America a great city on a hill. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, as Jesus says in Matthew 5. And as John Winthrop said in his sermon, the eyes of the people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause God to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So the Puritan agenda in the 17th century was fleeing the Church of England. They came to Massachusetts to establish a theocratic state on the lines of the way it was being done in Geneva, where the Calvinists had a theocratic state. And the English Puritans came here not for religious liberty, well, for religious liberty for themselves, but not for anybody else. They came here to establish a reformed theocracy. And they started to do that, and then it kind of all fell apart, largely because then England had a civil war and Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans got in power and the attention drifted away from us. So I think we need to be clear that when us liberals, us progressives talk about America as a secular nation, we are a diverse nation. And I'd say there's a big distance between the founders of the Constitution and Declaration of the Revolutionary War period are at some distance from the Puritans. I mean, they're 150 years later. But at least in our origins, there's a lot of American exceptionalistic Christian nationalist language going on there. So when people in the Christian nationalist movement point to the Puritans, we've got to sort of let them do that, because if we're going to be intellectually honest, that exceptionalistic America as a Christian place goes back deeply in our history. And then it's also all tied up with colonialism, right? I mean, because you had the Roman Catholics in other parts of North America. You had various kinds of missionary enterprises going on here that were in some sense an arm of colonialism, and in some sense our own missionary societies that established Anglicanism in the United States. The Church Missionary Society and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel were also in some sense part of this colonialist errand. So it's all very complicated. And I guess my point is that we need to start with some humility in this conversation. Now, having said that, the thing that makes me the craziest is when the people that want to make a Christianity the official religion of the United States. And by the way, and I'll find this for next week, but there have been some polls done recently that says something like 68% of Republicans want Christianity to be declared the official religion of the United States. Not 68% of everybody, but 68% of Republicans, and obviously the Republican Party is not the broad, diverse thing it was, but there's a substantial group of people in the country who don't really have an understanding of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and who want to say that America should be, if it isn't, it should be. It's like the official. I don't know what, like the official deodorant of the National League. I'm not always sure what it means to be the official religion of something. The official hot dog of the Dodgers, right? It's one of those kind of things. But in the 18th century, in the aftermath, both in the Revolutionary War and the aftermath in the Constitution, there was indeed a great variety of religious opinion among the founders. And so the founders were not all Bible-toting Christians. Some of them were Jews, some of them were Roman Catholics, and a lot of them were deists. And deists would not describe themselves as Christians. Deists were a sort of 18th century religion that was, basically sort of held that God was the kind of watchmaker of the universe and set the universe in motion and then went about other business. But Jesus and the whole ministry of Jesus and the salvation offered to us in Jesus is really not part of deism. So there's a wide variety of religious opinion among the founders. And again, that's part of the reason why the First Amendment prohibits the establishment of any religion, so that, again, it's a way to protect all of the religions in the country from one of them getting ascendancy. Now, you may know, or you may be surprised to know, that there were states actually had official religions, established religions. The country had no established religion. The Episcopal Church was the established religion in Virginia. In Massachusetts, the Congregational Church was the established church. And that's why Henry Thoreau went to jail. He went to jail because he would not pay the tax to support the Congregational Church in Concord. And basically, at the end of the 19th century, we wiped out all established churches. But that really was the issue. And there was a wide diversity of religious opinion in America, really from the Revolution onward. And then you, of course, had all this immigration. Germans came in great waves. Irish came in great waves. Scandinavians came in great waves. And then, of course, the Chinese and others who came. And the Germans were mostly Protestants and pietists. The Irish were Catholics. The Italians were Catholics. Central Europeans were Catholics. Then the great waves of Jewish immigration. So America's been pluralistic, really, if not from the get-go in 1629, at least from the turn of the 19th century onward. There were great religious movements in America. In the 1740s, the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Wesley, the great Methodist preacher, and then in the 19th century, of course, great missionary outbursts in American Christianity. When the Civil War came around, all of the major denominations split, North and South, except one. And the one denomination that did not split was the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. We had our General Convention in 1863, and we kept the seats of the bishops and the deputies open so that they could come back after the unpleasantness we had. Now, you could say that's a wonderfully inclusive and generous act on our part not to split. But on the other hand, we're the only major denomination that didn't really take a stand on slavery to the point of splitting over it. And so in some ways, again, we don't have entirely clean hands about race and racial justice because we were willing We didn't, if you don't think slavery and the Civil War is worth splitting over, what would you ever split over, I guess? What moral issue would be big enough for you to split over? And at least in the 19th century, there was nothing big enough. The Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, every other denomination split, and some of those splits have yet to be healed, but we did not. And I guess finally, and then I'll turn it over to Gabri, two more points. One of them is then at the end of the 19th century, because of the Gilded Age, because of the depredations of working people in the United States in terms of industrialism and mining and railroads and industrial accidents and child labor, there was a gigantic movement called the social gospel movement. In England, it started as the Christian socialist movement. And around the turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, I'd say all of the mainline denominations, including ours, really were afire with a desire to be relevant socially. And we did an awful lot with the Sunday school movement. Didn't start as church school in the church basement. It started as a way to teach people literacy, children who were working, a way to teach children basics of reading and writing and literacy and arithmetic and everything, to give them basic educations. And so we ended the 19th century in a great sort of forward-looking social justice moment. The last thing I'll say is that one of the theological terms that we'll probably use now and then is the term Erastianism. And it is a theological word that incorrectly named after a Swiss theologian, Erastus. And it's the idea that the state has supremacy over the church in religious matters. And it's always been a temptation of mainline churches to fall into Erastianism. Certainly the Church of England, time and again, has sort of that's what the Oxford movement was a rebellion against in the 19th century. The Church of England has always had this problem. We've had this problem in our own way. I mean, we had a pacifist bishop in the Episcopal Church, Paul Jones, whose Saints' Day was, I think, the day before yesterday. And Paul Jones he was the Bishop of Utah, and he was a pacifist. And he was defrocked in World War I because he preached pacifism. So the House of Bishops, as late as the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, as late as 1918, felt that a bishop who supported conscientious objectors and pacifism was un-American and therefore not fit to be a bishop. So this thing of Erastianism keeps working its way through our history. And in some ways, what we're seeing in the Christian nationalist movement is a new flowering of Erastianism. It's the idea, in some sense, that the state, it's a kind of flipping of Erastianism. And it's, in other words, it's going to the idea that the church and the state should be aligned in church affairs, and the church really ought to dictate to the state what state policy ought to be. And that's indeed very dangerous ground. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Gabriel and ask him to take us home. And I think we're going to go to 8:30, by the way. So just a heads up to people that may have other commitments.
Yeah, like my dinner, Gary. Come on, pal. All right, I guess I'm fasting. Jamie, I see a hand. Go. Unmute. There you go.
I just tried to reach the article that Gary put on paper, and unfortunately you need to be a subscriber to see it.
All
right.
right.
Well, I'll see if I can cut and paste it into something and send it to you all for next week. I am a subscriber, so I'll steal it.
All right. Well, tonight then we'll talk about a little bit about at least working view of what Christian nationalism is or can be defined as. And I was rather proud of the little blurb that we got for the class. So I'm interested in folks that find it lacking. For those that don't know what the heck I'm talking about, I'm going to try and cut and paste here so I can get it into the, there we go. So, Christian nationalism can be defined as a belief that the United States is largely shaped by its Anglo-Protestant past, that the government should take active steps to ensure that Christianity continues to hold a privileged position in the public square, and by the fear that the country will lose both its identity and its freedom if it does not preserve its religious and cultural inheritance. As you can see, that working definition there has a past, a present, and a future, right? So it talks about the past as in the United States. It talks about in the present how we should push for a position in the public square. And in the future, there is great fear and great warnings that if we slide from here, we will indeed fall off a very steep cliff and become something other than we should be nationally. To be even more simple about it, I would say that Christian nationalism, if you took Christianity on the one hand, and you took nationalism, or maybe even patriotism, if that's a better word, I don't know that it is, but if you pulled them together into a Venn diagram, if the two became one without any space in between them, I would say that would be a pretty good marker for Christian nationalism. Now, there was an article from Christianity Today way back in February of this year, and they took a stab at defining it, and I will put a link for that in the as soon as before we hang up tonight. I'll give you the link for that. But it's kind of a Q&A, and as you know, Christianity Today is no pinko lefty newspaper. It's rather mainstream. And so in their little Q&A with themselves, they ask, and I'm going to edit this for time, but they ask questions like, what is patriotism and is it good? Patriotism is love of country. It is different from nationalism, which is an argument about how to define our country. Christians should recognize that patriotism is good because all creation is good. Patriotism helps us appreciate our particular place in it. Our affection and loyalty to a specific part of God's creation help us to do the good work of cultivating and improving the part we happen to live in. As Christians, we can and should love the United States, which also means working to improve our country by holding it up for critique and working for justice when it errs. And then it goes on to define nationalism. There are many definitions of nationalism and an active debate about how to best define it. Most scholars agree that nationalism starts with the belief that humanity is divisible into mutually distinct, internally coherent cultural groups, defined by shared traits like language, religion, ethnicity, or culture. From there, scholars say nationalists believe that these groups should each have their own governments, that government should promote and protect a nation's cultural identity, that sovereign national groups provide meaning and purpose for human beings. And then it asks, what is Christian nationalism? Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Popularly, Christian nationalists assert that America is and must remain a, quote, Christian nation, end quote. not merely as an observation about American history, but as a prescriptive program for what America must continue to be in its future. Scholars like Samuel Huntington have made similar arguments that America is defined by its Anglo-Protestant past, that we will lose our identity and our freedom if we do not preserve our cultural inheritance. Christian nationalists do not reject the First Amendment and do not advocate for theocracy, but they do believe that Christianity should enjoy a privileged position in the public square. The term Christian nationalism is relatively new, and its advocates generally do not use it of themselves, but it accurately describes American nationalists who believe American identity is inextricable from Christianity. Christian nationalists want to define America as a Christian nation that they want the government to promote a specific cultural template as the official culture of the country. Some have advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to recognize America's Christian heritage, others to reinstitute prayer in public schools. Some work to enshrine a Christian nationalist interpretation of American history in school curricula, including that America has a special relationship with God or has been chosen by him to carry out a special mission on earth. Others advocate for immigration restrictions, specifically to prevent a change to American religious and ethnic demographics or change to American culture. Some want to empower the government to take stronger action to circumscribe immoral behavior. Some, again, like the scholar Samuel Huntington, have argued that the United States government must defend and enshrine its predominant Anglo-Protestant culture to ensure the survival of American democracy. And sometimes Christian nationalism is most evident not in its political agenda, but in the sort of attitude with which it is held, an unstated presumption that Christians are entitled to primacy of place in the public square because they are heirs of the true or essential heritage of American culture, that Christians have a presumptive right to define the meaning of the American experiment because they see themselves as America's architects, first citizens, and guardians. The article goes on to talk about how this might be dangerous for America and for the church. And although it's not a deep dive into it, I think it does a pretty good job of describing what we'll be focusing on through the lens of theology and then politics as well as media. Each of which have fed into the stream and interwoven in interesting ways and in unpredictable ways, so that today the three are there's not a lot of daylight among the three of them there. So I'm going to stop for a second and ask for questions for Gary or myself so far. And wave a hand or even just unmute yourself.
I'm not sure how, what the time issue is for folks. I think a couple of folks have already signed off. And so the question is, do we want to go longer or do we want to come back next week? I think you had some things also to say, Gabri, about sort of, various movements that sort of weave together over the last 100 years or so to get us to this point. I mean, do you want to talk about that next week?
I think I do, only because it's when I started looking at this, my assumption was this would be for a number of seminary students that wouldn't mind going into the weeds in terms of real inside baseball. I'm not, I won't go too deep in terms of the church next week, but I do want to get into some theology, and especially dispensational theology, which I think is a cornerstone of much of popular theology for the reasons that I'll give next week. That has morphed and changed in some corners to include what has been called dominion theology. And I think this is where we get closer to the heart of Christian nationalism, at least in a way that I see that it's not helpful to the nation and can cause more suffering than it can otherwise. Let me see if I did that here. Yeah, I did. Okay. So there's the Christianity Today article, if you're interested. And I think next week, I do want to talk about dispensationalism, its founders, coming all the way from the UK and our Anglican forebears, to the specifically American flavor of it, what was going on in the world, what was going on in our culture, and how it became, in many ways, the bedrock of teaching, certainly by the time the 1960s and 70s came around, and I encountered the evangelical and charismatic church. So that's where I'm going to pick up the threads of the story. And Gary, I don't know. Did you have any thoughts about?
I'll just say one more thing, and then if nobody has anything else, we can adjourn till next week. That is, and I'll put this in the chat. I just read last year a wonderful book by Jill Lepore, who teaches at Harvard and writes in the New Yorker, a book called These Truths, and it's a 1-volume history of the United States. And she wrote it, it's very readable because she's a New Yorker writer, you know. Not all scholars are great prose stylists, but she is. It's a very readable book. And her point is that, you know, I'm 72 this month, and I think I'm in one of the last grades in high school, 1967, my class, where we had civics. And civics has disappeared in American high schools. And so we've really got a bunch of people in this country that don't know sort of basic things about like how our government works. And so the fact that 68% of Republicans can think there ought to be an official religion in the United States means that those people also probably don't understand the difference between a city councilor and a county supervisor, right? I mean, there's a kind of general lack of basic literacy about just basic functions of government. Well, her history, it's great because also she, you know, the Trump era frightened her to death. And so, but she said, you know, a lot of the things that people were saying were absolutely new under Donald Trump, in fact, were not new at all. I mean, and I think what we're saying is in some sense, Christian nationalism, although it certainly emerged after January 6th, or around January 6th in terms of public consciousness, it's really, as I was trying to say, this goes back to the Arabella in 1629, and other things like nativism, you know, race. We know a lot about racism, but there's also been nativism and isolationism and all kinds of other things. You know, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 19th century. There's been all kinds of the Know Nothing Party back in the mid 19th century, and so it's what she did was she wrote a history of the United States, basically foregrounding the issues we're all concerned about now and showing their antecedents all the way through the whole period. So I'll put it in the chat. It's called These Truths by Jill Lepore, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I learned a lot from it. Other thoughts, questions, observations? Yes, Jamie.
One thought I have is some of the emerging issues and threats, the more global type, in particular climate change, and what its effect is going to be on poor people and people to the south of us, in part because the whole the most noticeable impact of the climate change seems to be happening in the tropics, sort of slightly north, slightly south, in terms of droughts, in terms of excess rain, erratic weather, stuff like this. If it continues, there have been some recent studies that I think are very credible ones that suggest some of the scenarios are not quite apocalyptic, but really, really bad. And that's in not necessarily my lifetime, but in the next 20, 30 years. So within the lifetime of a lot of people around. And that's going to have, I think, a profound impact on everything, including this country. And I think to ignore something that may be so dystopian and profound a threat to our country and to our existence has got to figure into kind of the forward-looking conversations we have about theology and just humanism and the rest, because I think there are going to be some profound impacts.
Sure.
And I don't think they'll be all for the good. And I'm
Well,
worried.
Jamie, you're not wrong. And I think that's where theology can either be helpful or not so helpful. And I'll touch a little bit on that next week.
I'm not trying to change the curriculum.
No,
I'm
no,
just
no,
saying-
and you won't. But but your point is well taken, and maybe we'll get to more of that on the last week as we talk about what we might be able to do for future steps. But I will tell you that there is a strain of theology, and I'm well versed in it, that says Jesus is coming back at any moment, so we don't have to care about the planet. Jesus will be coming back before anything really bad will happen. So lay your mind at rest and don't worry about it and just go on with your life. That is a pretty good paraphrase of what I was told by more than one pastor at more than one occasion. So I know that it's easy to kind of see this Christian nationalism not so much as a waffle as it is a bowl of spaghetti, because things touch and interweave and connect in various ways. So sometimes kind of untangling that can be a bit of a chore, but it's, I think, worthwhile because of the very concerns that you have that are very real and very present, I would argue. So
Well,
thank you for that. Anne, yeah.
Speaking to what Jamie was talking about, I mean,
So, Kathy, hang on just a second.
Sorry, we'll let Kathy can go because it has to do with Jamie's comment.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Mine has to do with Jamie's comment too. Is that it was an article in the New York Times a while back, and it was basically saying that, you know, Christian nationalism was the Republican viewpoint, you know, which was like Trump and excluding global warming and all manner of things, which it just sort of, I mean, it's terrifying in a lot of ways. So at any rate, I'm also really interested in the global warming piece because I think it can just all unravel with that, especially if the Christian nationalist political chip is used to, you know, get rid of anything that would have to do with like controlling global warming.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that makes sense. It's been a really long day.
Yeah, no,
It's true.
thank you, Kathy.
It's true. It's true.
Anne, go ahead.
So my question is probably more for Gary, as he talked about history kind of before 1900. And admittedly, a lot of civics I've been learning later in life, probably I would say graduate school forward, just self-taught through books and CDs and courses and that sort of thing. But Gary, could you speak to, you know, when Gabri reads this Christian nationalism sentence, belief the US was shaped by its Anglo-Protestant past, is it possible, based on your understanding of history going back to the founding fathers, is it possible, like one of the things I've learned, and it could be wrong, is that the dividing line from the beginning of the nation could be viewed as how one views man. Fundamentally, is man inherently good and always behaves well? Or if left to his own devices, man, meaning people, men, women, all of us, needs constraints, right, to have a civilized society. And so rather than Anglo-Protestant as a dividing line, more of how the nature of man is defined, and then how this country was designed. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a couple just quick thoughts. One of them is, the Puritans had a very, and sort of this relates to what Gabby was saying in a weird way about the sort of dispensationalist thing about climate change, right? Jesus is coming back and it won't matter.
Right.
Well, the Puritans, one of the problems about being a Puritan is, God is sovereign and inscrutable. And so you never knew if you were saved or not. That's why Puritans all kept journals, because they were looking to sort of record their spiritual lives and look for signs of their election, right? But Puritans believed in predestination. And so, there's frankly nothing you could do to earn predestination and no way you could ever be sure. And one of the things they learned after about 30 or 40 years in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was it was a terribly difficult way to try to govern a community. So, I mean, like, why would I stop at a red light? Well, they didn't have red lights in the 17th century, but why would I obey the law if, it didn't matter. I mean, it didn't matter what I did, because I'd be either elect or not, and God was in charge of that and I wasn't. So, and they began to have to find ways to fudge predestination. They called it the halfway covenant. They had to do all kinds of things to massage it so that they could run the country, right? They could run the state. So I think one of the issues is this shows time after again that, theology can actually work against. I mean, we're a pragmatic tradition, Anglicanism. I mean, we do theology out of our experience. The Protestants, the Puritans, and in some way the whole evangelical tradition do theology kind of top down, from principles down, right? We do theology from the ground up. We're like common law, the way our English common law makes law out of case law. We do theology out of our lived experience. That's a very different experience than something like dispensationalism or Puritanism, which start with abstract principles and try to go down. The other thing, though, I think you're right in terms of this fundamental, are people good or not, is that the Constitution is in some sense the Constitution is a very conservative document, and the reason it has these checks and balances that balance the various forms of government against each other is because its basic belief is that people are no damn good, and they have to be constrained. They have to be played off against each other, right? So you've got the executive, the judicial, the legislative, and there's enough power spread out through the system so that nobody can be in control, and that because especially the legislature is the voice of the people, and how unruly and untrustworthy they are, right? So we've got to have these other two branches. So I think you're right. There is this fundamental thing within, and I think it's I used to be much more, I'm much more a believer. After 72 years of living, I grew up as a kind of rosy progressive, and I'm still politically progressive, but I have a much more lived experience of original sin, I guess. And so it's not that I believe everybody's no good, but I believe the problem of human sin and human evil are intractable issues we're stuck with as human beings. And I guess makes me a kind of an Orthodox Christian in a way. I'm not, and I think in some ways that divide has been true in the church, and I think it's also been true in our politics, right? I mean, so the idea that progressives mean that the idea that you could eventually get everything right and we'd have a utopia. We'd be living in a utopia. And that so far has not happened to my experience.
Amen.
We have 4 more minutes and I do need to end at 8:30. But yes, Kathy.
One more thing is I've been reading this book called Sapiens, and it's actually really fascinating because it's sort of, Neanderthals are around for like 250,000 years. And then all of a sudden here we come and we've been here 30,000 years and look what we've done to the planet. But it goes through sort of the personality traits or our characteristics that were born that gave us, the ability to lie. So we could imagine what it would be like if we told somebody the not truth, following. I mean, there's just a whole list of things that became, what do you call it? That we grew into, sort of like these characteristics, like magic powers, only we all have them. And we've used them, unfortunately, a lot of times for ill purpose. I'll try to remember to get the chart that he puts in the book because it's
called Sapiens.
It's like history of people. It's
Best
excellent.
All right, one more thought, comment, question, complaint.
It's going to be exciting.
Yeah, tell me before we hang up. Let me. I'm with this definition of Christian nationalism. I tried to shape it, and I think we're trying to shape this class in a way that even the most dyed-in-the-wool Christian nationalists would recognize themselves here and would say that's a fair depiction of who we are and what we're about. So is there any pushback from people on this, the deck being too stacked here? The things are not fair in terms of how we're defining the subject and the folks that's ascribed to it. Yeah, Colleen, I see your hand.
Yes, and I put my hand down earlier, but your question makes me think of my question again. I don't know if this is specific to tweaking the definition of Christian nationalism that you have, but when you first started defining it for us, and I asked this question in my introduction, was patriotism and nationalism, what's the relationship? And you kind of seemed to say they could be used interchangeably. And I wanted to get some clarity on that because I think what could perhaps make a Christian nationalist, whatever that will be, we'll learn, relate more to the definition is what we all relate to, in a sense, is what love of God and country. Like what's wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
But
I consider myself a patriot, but not a nationalist.
And I'd love to know more about that because as I age, well, I've been this way since I was younger. I tend to not identify as a patriot and tend to resist, the national anthem and the 4th of July, and it's increasing with age. So I'm curious how we reconcile the two.
Yeah,
I think
so
that's an interesting, an interesting conversation. I think we need it.
And Gary, I want to hear your thoughts, but let me just clarify my comment, Colleen, which was what I meant to convey is that I believe that most self-described Christian nationalists would conflate patriotism and nationalism into interchangeable definitions. I think if you take a peek at the Christianity Today article that I referenced in the chat, they do an okay job of at least describing the difference between the two terms of patriotism and nationalistic thought. But Gary, go ahead and.
No, I think that's something we ought to put in the hopper. That's all I'm saying. I agree, Colleen. I mean, I'm sort of where you are. I mean, patriot is probably too strong a word. I honor my country. I love God and Jesus, and I think those are the, But I don't want to hold any nation state up to it's idolatry, essentially, it seems to me. I mean, because, remember the early Christians were persecuted because they wouldn't worship Caesar as a god, right? And in some ways, I think Christians, I think we always, there's a strain of our Christianity of which I feel myself a part, and I think you do too, that has always been skeptical about the nation state's claims to ultimate allegiance.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I do, I pay my taxes and I vote in my elections and I worked at the National Cathedral. I had to do all kinds of, I had to put flowers on Woodrow Wilson's grave, I mean, a wreath on Woodrow Wilson's grave every year, before we realized what a racist jerk he was. So, but I think I just think exploring that, like, how does a Christian, I mean, there's a range of ways Christians feel about any country, right? I mean, it's not just America. I think it's true for French Christians or, Malawian Christians, right? That where does the nation stand in my spiritual hierarchy, I guess?
Yeah, and Gary, it's I think we can also see this happening. This is not just an American phenomenon. This is
Right.
happening in other countries in the world where Christian nationalists are pushing back against what they see as a dilution of their national identity and their beloved faith. So I think you're right. This is a rich topic to be explored. And then, Colleen, I want to hear more about, maybe next week or the week after, about how you're feeling in terms of the nation and all of that. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be a part of this. And Gary, thank you for inviting us all here.
Thank you all. And Suzanne, you had your hand up. You can have the last word here.
I was just going to say that so much in life, I think it's a sliding scale because we're all attached to where we live. We all believe in what we believe. But as soon as you carry that into the extremes on either side, that's where we're getting into trouble. And so it's just a matter of figuring out where you draw the line.
All right. Well, Gabby and I will confer between now and next Tuesday, and we'll figure out how to address every single concern that you guys brought up.
And Suzanne, a fan of the Via Media. Well done, sister.
Excellent. That's an Anglican place to stop at.
There you go.
What can I say?
Thank you all so much.
Thank
I'll see you all
everybody.
next week.
Next week.
Bye.
Thanks for being
See
here.
some of you Sunday.
It was a
Bye-bye.
great class. I'm looking forward to the rest of them.
Right.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.